Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Birkbeck and to our lecture, which this evening is hosted by Birkbeck in collaboration with University College London. My name is David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, and the Q&A, which will follow this evening's lecture, will be chaired by my colleague Shirley Gilbert, Professor of Modern History at UCL in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies there. I'm now going to say something which I have never said before. We are not expecting a fire drill this evening. We are not expecting a fire alarm this evening. So if a fire alarm sounds, you must evacuate the building, and colleagues will direct you to safety and to a muster point. Please follow their instructions. It is a singular honour to welcome Ambassador Lipstadt to Birkbeck this evening. A distinguished historian as well as a diplomat, her career provides an outstanding demonstration of how scholarship can inform work for the public good, nationally and internationally. And further, it demonstrates how engagement with the public sphere can generate scholarship of lasting value. Many of you will recall that in the late 1990s, Ambassador Lipstadt decisively won a libel trial against David Irving, who had sued following her characterization of him as a Holocaust denier in her book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. It is a matter of pride that Birkbeck historians Sir Richard Evans and Nick Waxman played vital roles in Ambassador Lipstadt's triumphant defence, as well as the lawyer Anthony Julius, who is connected to UCL. Ambassador Lipstadt is here today in her current role as the United States Special Envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. This is all the more significant because we witness a surge in recorded anti-Semitic incidents internationally and in the UK. This is the case whether we look at trends over a period of years or whether we focus on the weeks and months since October last year. Like all of you here today in this audience, I greatly look forward to Ambassador Lipstadt's reflections and her analysis of the challenges presented by anti-Semitism here and now. A further challenge we face concerns the disagreements which exist over the relationship between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. Within universities and within the realm of policy discourse, this debate has been crystallized by two definitions of anti-Semitism: the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism, which has been adopted by many governments, including our own in the UK, and the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. There is common ground between these definitions, but sharp differences arise when they address the relationship between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. As it turns out, Ambassador Lipstadt sees significant merit in the IHRA working definition and has praised it as an effective tool, while, contrastingly, I have been a critic and also had a hand in drafting the Jerusalem Declaration. Substantive and civil discussion on this issue, on the relationship between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, is not only inevitable, it is also a sign of health, both in democracy and in academic life. Conversely, it is profoundly harmful when public figures traduce recent critics of the IHRA working definition and seek to expel them from the sphere of legitimate debate. So I welcome Ambassador Lipstadt today for a great many reasons, but not least because her visit to Birkbeck, her lecture this evening, and her discussion with me and BISA colleagues earlier this afternoon constitute an object lesson in substantive engagement and pluralism in the academic sphere on a subject that is of vital concern to us all. In this regard, I ask us all to remember that this evening is a university event. Different rules apply in different contexts and different settings. The university and its lecture theatre provide a space in which differing views are exchanged and freely expressed. Speakers and questioners alike are given a respectful hearing. Ambassador Lipstadt, it is a huge privilege to have you here today, and we look forward to your lecture from right to left and in between, Jew hatred across the political divide.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Feldman. Thank you, Birkbeck. Thank you, UCL. And thank you all for coming. It's a delight to be here. I spent many months here, as some of you know, obviously. And coming here when I don't have to go to the royal courts is always a great pleasure. I really appreciate this chance. My remit, my portfolio at the United States State Department is to monitor and combat, as my title says, anti-Semitism. And it's in that capacity that I come here tonight. At the same time, I'm well aware, as we all are, of the conflagration currently underway in the Middle East. The pain, suffering, and trauma are very real and ongoing. I, together with many, and I would assume most, if not all, people in this audience, mourn the death of all those who have died or been killed in this fight. I pay particular attention, of course, to the death of children and grieve over all of them, irrespective of their particular identity. But that is not the topic of my talk. My topic of my talk is anti-Semitism. How do we understand it? And some of the things I will say will be self-evident, but it's my desire to sort of frame our understanding and ask questions about how we look at it and how we approach it. Anti-Semitism is a prejudice and shares the characteristics of all other prejudices. Firstly, it is irrational, as are all prejudices. Think of the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I see a man with a yarmulke. I know he must be a cheat. I see a woman with a hijab. I know she must be the mother of a terrorist. I see a black man. I know they must be, to use the pejorative term, a thug or something else derogatory. I may know nothing about you other than your race, your religion, or possibly your sexual orientation. Yet based on that, I determine your worthiness, your character, your morals. In short, by virtue of your particular identity, I know who and what you are. A ridiculous notion. Secondly, prejudice, all prejudices, treat the group in question as a whole. The prejudiced person attributes the bad characteristics of a particular member of the group to the entire group. So if a member of the group does something that the prejudicial person feels to be wrong or finds unacceptable, they will declare, oh, you see, the XYZs are like that. The actions of one become the actions of all. And conversely, should the person do something positive and act not in a manner typical of the group, the prejudiced person opines, oh, she's one of the good ones, not like the rest. It's the sort of thing of some of my best friends are whatever. When I was young, I remember once going into a store, a hardware store. My father had to buy something for the synagogue. I think it was to build the sukkah or whatever it was. And he explained to the proprietor what he needed for, he said, I'm a member of the synagogue and we're building this thing and this is what we need. And the man said, oh, some of my best friends are Jews. And when we walked out, I said to my father, oh, that's so nice. My father said to me something which I didn't understand at the time, but now I fully understand. He said, you'll never hear someone proclaim some of my best friends are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If you're boasting about it, you know, you're saying either I'm friendly with the good ones, or look at me, I'm so good, I'm friendly with members of that particular group. Now, however, so clearly anti-Semitism fits into the nature of prejudice, and the characteristics of prejudice, rather, and can be understood, analyzed by using many of the same tools we would use to analyze other prejudices. However, it also has unique characteristics, ones that distinguish it from other prejudices and consequently often make it more difficult to understand and to combat. First of all, there is its age-old nature. Some historians call it the oldest or the longest hatred, and in many respects they are correct. No other prejudice has both such ancient and consistent histories. Not only is it ancient, but it is consistent through history. The anti-Semitic charges are so old and so consistently baked into Western culture, and I use that term as broadly as possible, that many people accept them as fact. They don't think of themselves as anti-Semitic, but Jews are like that, whatever that may be. Secondly, unlike most other prejudices, anti-Semitism is ubiquitous, free-flowing, coming from all ends of the political spectrum. It's not a hatred that is limited to one particular place, orientation, or political outlook. It can emanate from anyone and anywhere, those on the right, those on the left, and those in the middle. It can come from Christians, it can come from Muslims, it can come from atheists, and of course it can come from Jews. More about that in a moment. Thirdly, and this is probably the most significant difference, unlike other prejudices, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy myth. I do not use the word conspiracy theory because theories can be proven. It is a conspiracy myth. Conspiracy serves as the prism through which the anti-Semite's view of the Jew is refracted. It's the cornerstone of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semite convinced that Jews use their wealth, their supposed putative wealth, putative power, and smarts to wreak havoc on the non-Jewish world, find the Jewish hand in any deleterious or inconvenient events in history. The anti-Semite begins convinced that Jews have engaged in conspiracy and seeks to determine the exact nature of that conspiracy. If something bad happens in society, or something they oppose, they of course are sure the Jew is behind it. But sometimes it works in reverse. The conspiracist, the person who has fallen into the rabbit hole, the dark hole, whatever you want to call it, of conspiracy theories, seeking an explanation for some bad turn of events, whether it be COVID, whether it be political wrongdoings, financial mishaps, looks for a group with, or an entity, which has the power, the wealth, and the malicious inclinations and qualities capable of engineering such a conspiracy. They may not start out by looking for the Jew, but once the conspiracy theorist sets up that prism, who could be powerful enough to do this? Who could be evil enough to do this? Who could be clever enough and crafty enough? I know it's hard to see that, capricious enough to do this. It must be the Jews. There is only one group with that power and evil inclination. In contrast to those who begin by looking for bad things Jews have done, the conspiracy theorist begins not with the Jews, but that is where they end up. And of course they end up there because it makes sense to them. After all, Jews are like that. going back to my comment about the age-old nature of the hatred. Finally, there is the phenomenon which I've written about quite a bit of punching up and punching down. Most prejudices, certainly when we're talking about racism of all sorts, posit that the reviled group is lesser than the rest of society. This, as I say, this is particularly true for racial and ethnic prejudices. For example, the racist opines, should people from that group move into our neighborhood, there goes the neighborhood. Should their children go to our children's school, there goes the school. The prejudiced person, in this case of the racist, reviles the person of color as being of lesser value. And they have to know their place. They punch down in order to keep them in their place. They need them in society to do certain work, to fulfill certain functions, but they should know their place, never rising to a position of power, certainly never rising to a position of power over the group that the prejudiced person considers to be the society. The anti-Semite also punches down, saying Jews are dirty, Jews are revolting, Jews spread disease, Jews spread COVID, all sorts of things like that. And that is particularly directed at certain segments of the Jewish community. But here's the distinction. The anti-Semite also punches up. The Jews, the anti-Semites are convinced, again, using the stereotype, the template, the template of stereotypes associated with anti-Semitism, Jews being more powerful, able to control matters, more able to control things than the rest of us. They revile Jews, but they also fear them. They know how to, they're on top, they somehow have managed to gain power. Remember, the Jew is other, never an intrinsic part of the society, and it is this fear of the Jew's putative ability to control society and cause harm to the non-Jewish world that determines for the anti-Semite that the Jew must be fought assiduously. They must be stopped by any means necessary. So in other words, it's not just keeping them in their place, as would be the case of the anti-black racism, but it's protecting myself from the threat they pose to me. Anti-Semitism is not confined to the fringes of society. It's not a relic of the past, but a present-day reality that manifests itself in insidious ways, permeating all corners of our world. Earlier, I noted its ubiquity. Anti-Semitism rears its head across the political spectrum. It can be found amongst far-right extremists who peddle age-old tropes of Jewish conspiracies, racial superiority, to the far-left activists, some of whom may rely on anti-Semitism to express their political views or cloak their anti-Semitism in political arguments. We also see it amongst radical extremist Islamists or jihadists, some of whom share these conspiratorial views as they engage in anti-Semitic imagery, rhetoric, and action. Anti-Semitism must be taken seriously. And in this day and age, that may seem like a superfluous thing to say. But there are too many people, and for too long, who haven't taken it seriously, who seem to think that it's not as much of a threat as other forms of prejudice. Of course, it's not a zero-sum game, and it's not a comparative thing, which is worse, which is all these prejudices are dangerous. But anti-Semitism is a lethal hatred. There are many ways in which the failure to take it seriously are manifest. There are those who contend that Jews have no right to complain. It's impossible for them to be victims of prejudice because they are white, rich, and powerful. The first person who makes this claim ignores the fact that they have themselves relied on an anti-Semitic canard. Many, if not most, Jews in the world are not white. Many are not wealthy. And even if they were both white and wealthy, does that make prejudicial hatred justifiable? Would anybody say to a member of the LGBT community, a segment of which is white and wealthy, that therefore the prejudice, the real overt prejudice against them is not to be taken seriously? Another manifestation, I think, of the failure to take anti-Semitism seriously, and on this I think Professor Feldman and I were in some vigorous conversation earlier, feels that it's only of value if it's mentioned in tandem with an array of other hatreds, even when the act in question is an anti-Semitic act. They condemn anti-Semitism, but only in the context of all other acts of prejudice. It is as if anti-Semitism does not belong to the true category of outrages, and therefore cannot stand alone as a real concern. I am not sure if they feel that they have to justify their concern about anti-Semitism, or it's only legitimate if they're also fighting against other hatreds. Other hatreds, of course, must be fought, and I'm not talking about privileging one over the other. My topic tonight is anti-Semitism. And no society has ever benefited from hatred in its midst. But to fight a particular hatred, any hatred, racism, homophobia, misogyny, hatred of Muslims, or anti-Semitism, first you have to call it out for what it is. And I have seen too many examples, and many people who have reached out to me with these examples. And of course, it's anecdotal, but after a while you amass enough anecdotes and you say you see a pattern, where they tell me their university, their corporation, their law firm, whatever it might be, has condemned a particular act of anti-Semitism, but only in the context of and other hatred. So we condemn, even though they're talking about an incident of anti-Semitism and and again, they're not saying their corporation, entity, whatever it is, should not be against those other forms of hatred. But at this moment, the act that is in question, or that precipitated the statement, was an act of anti-Semitism. The example that I use is in my country, when George Floyd was murdered because 4 police officers stood on him, and one stood on him with his knee on his neck, making it impossible for him to breathe. Many people condemned it, and condemned it quite vigorously, as it was to be condemned. But had they issued statements saying we condemn the racism which was behind George, or was intrinsic to George Floyd's murder, and we condemn misogyny, homophobia, and hatred of Muslims and people would say, what are you talking about? It's the same thing when Black Lives Matter, and that motto or statement or call, some people said, well, all lives matter. But what was clear was, in this question we were talking about an issue of racism. Professor Mary Fulbrook is here. Your work on the Holocaust is so important. And were someone to say, the Nazis killed 6 million people in gas chambers and mass shootings, many of us would say, wait a minute, yes, but they killed them not as people, they killed them as Jews. So in the same way George Floyd was killed as a black man, there's no question about that. So it's necessary to call out the specific thing, and then you can step back and say, and this is part of a larger set of prejudices. But when it comes from anti-Semitism, there is a discernible tendency to sort of not feel it's legitimate unless it's coupled with other things. One of the most striking aspects of anti-Semitism today is its ability to transcend traditional ideological boundaries. Simply put, anti-Semitism is the hatred that can be described as a horseshoe, where the far left end of the horseshoe and the far right end of the horseshoe come together, and they're closer together on the issue of anti-Semitism than they are to the center. In fact, recent studies, sociological studies, have suggested that a better predictor of anti-Semitism is not a right or left-wing perspective, but a conspiratorial worldview and a penchant for authoritarian types of government, wherever they might come from on the political spectrum. Rather than a right-left dichotomy, a more accurate predictor of anti-Semitism, of an anti-Semitic worldview, is the adherence to this conspiratorial perspective, anti-hierarchical aggression, and a preference for authoritarianism. And this, of course, can describe someone at either end of the political spectrum. It's not limited to one end or the other. I'm often asked, and in my Senate hearings, in fact, as an ambassador, I had to go through confirmation. I was asked by the senators, one of the senators during the hearings at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which I thought was worse, right or left-wing anti-Semitism. And I told the senator that I didn't like to engage in hierarchies in that sense, and that I saw myself as an equal opportunity fighter of anti-Semitism. Had I not been in such an august setting as the Senate hearing room, I might have channeled the bard of Yiddish literature and humor, Shalom Aleichem, who I could imagine, author of Tevye the Milchker, Tevye the Milkman, Fiddler, and eventually Fiddler on the Roof, as it became. I might have channeled him as saying, that question is akin to asking someone, would I rather be struck by cholera in Odessa or dysentery in Kyiv? Neither, thank you. In this regard, however, I've discerned an interesting and disturbing tendency amongst those who are concerned, deeply, often personally concerned, about the dangers of anti-Semitism. Their concerns are genuine, but their vision is often distorted. Those who place themselves, let's say, on the right, more conservative ends of the political spectrum, see anti-Semitism on the left. And what they see is very accurate. They aren't imagining things, they aren't making anything up. And those on the left see anti-Semitism on the right. And they too are not imagining things or seeing anything that isn't there. The problem is, what they fail to see is the anti-Semitism right next to them, espoused by people who share many of their other political and social views and political stances. And if you only see it on the other side of the political transom from where you situate yourself, then I have to question whether your battle is with anti-Semitism or with your political opponents. Whether you are really interested in fighting anti-Semitism or using it as a weapon against your political opponents. It's sort of the whataboutism, if you say, well, what about the other side? We have long been deeply aware of the dangers of right-wing anti-Semitism. I spent the past 5 days and the weekend in Germany at the Munich Security Conference, and in my conversations, my third trip as ambassador to Germany, there has long been, and any of you who worked with Germany know Germany or follow the news, there is a serious concern about the dangers of right-wing extremism and right-wing anti-Semitism, particularly as expressed by the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD. And it is a real concern in my country. Of course, we had the famous Charleston March and Rally, where the marchers marched, Jews will not replace us, expressing their commitment to the replacement. When that happened, I got all these phone calls, what do they mean, replace us? And of course, what they were saying goes back to the punching up, punching down. They believe, of course, in the Great Replacement theory, which had a recent iteration in France, but it really goes way back. I saw it already when I first started working on denial in the 1970s and 80s, where in the United States, people on the far right looked around and saw people of color advancing. It was post the Civil Rights Act, post the Fair Housing Act, and people of color, black people, were advancing not as fast as it should be and not as much as it should be, but in a way that hadn't been the case before. And these people, remember, punching down, punching up, these people are not as smart as us or as capable as us to be reaching this position. There must be someone behind them. Someone who knows how to act behind the scenes. Someone who has an interest in advancing them that will serve their own interests. But they know how to do it behind the curtains. It's sort of, when you think about Christianity's depiction of the Jew as the devil, the characteristics of the devil were two. The devil was the only one who could harm God, which the Jews did, according to Christian theology. And the devil did his handiwork and disappeared before you knew you had encountered the devil. The devil was sneaky, the devil was capricious. So right there, you got, that was part of the origins of the anti-Semitic template, which of course then migrated well outside the church. So when they were saying Jews will not replace us, that the Jews working behind the scenes through black people were trying to change society from a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant society into a more mixed society at their expense. I read in the course, I was served as an expert witness in the civil trial against the organizers of the Charlottesville rally and march. Of course, one woman was murdered by a driver, Heather Heyer, but others were beaten up, others were severely traumatized, physically beaten, and they brought a civil suit against the organizers, and I was an expert witness and asked by the court, very interestingly, to explain why when you watch the marchers, they didn't march with swastikas. There was only one swastika flag. But all the other flags, for those of us who are knowledgeable of Nazi symbolism and iconography, saw all sorts of different symbols which are directly connected to the Third Reich. And then when you read the reams of their emails and exchanges, which of course were gotten by the by the people bringing the case on discovery, you saw the so many references to the Third Reich and to Nazism. And one of my jobs was to explain to the court and to the jury what this Jews will not replace us meant and why there was in a march and a rally concerned with supposedly taking down civil war statues, Robert E. Lee and others, why there was all this anti-Semitism, how did it connect? And that, of course, was anti-Semitism, pure and simple, of the far right. But I don't want to dwell on that as much tonight. I want to spend the rest of the time really dwell on anti-Semitism that we see on the other end of the spectrum. We who are of the university world, and yes, I know I'm not part of a government, but after over 3 decades in academic life, you can take the woman out of the university, but you can't take the university out of the woman. Generally, we are, in the academic world, far more aware of anti-Semitism and other prejudices that emanate from the right than we are from prejudices that emanate from the political left. And that's what we've seen in recent weeks, and I want to spend the last part of my lecture sort of looking at that. Let me state something which is a given and shouldn't even have to be said, and is usually only said because those who engage in anti-Semitism then claim that they're not doing it. But it's clear that criticism of Israeli policies is not anti-Semitism. It's a ridiculous concept, because if that were the case, the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who were on the street every night, for Saturday night, for months, would be anti-Semites, and clearly they were not, and they are not. But there have been responses to Israel in general and to the current crisis, and again, I'm not here to talk about the specifics of the crisis, except where some of the actions reflected certain anti-Semitic trends. There have been certain reactions that are rooted in or emblematic of anti-Semitism. One is the phenomenon of denial. Holocaust denial, of course, took a decade and a half, 2 decades to really get any traction. It had its origins in Argentina to a great degree, to the the German expats who listened to Adolf Eichmann tell the story of what happened. This was impossible, and they began the trend towards denial, which then grew in many ways. But today we're witnessing another form of denial, one that has anti-Semitic aspects or is actually anti-Semitic in nature. Consider the rash of gender-based violence, which is an antiseptic term for rape, mutilation of genitalia, cutting off of breasts, and more, and I have seen the evidence, the pictures, more numerous and more horrible than I ever imagined, that occurred on October 7th in a variety of places in areas of Israel that were invaded by Hamas terrorists. There's been denial that that happened and didn't happen, or even worse, claims that Israel did this in order, as an excuse, to invade Gaza, which is a sort of a canard of, it's even an aspect of the deniers. The deniers never quite were worried about consistency. So they would say the Holocaust didn't happen, but Jews were deserving of it happening, or the Holocaust didn't happen, and those outrages, which they couldn't somehow explain away, were really committed by Jews because the Jews wanted a state, and they were working together with the Nazis, etc. So what I've seen in here is I've been appalled by the abysmally slow response of international organizations, governments, and civil society, particularly from those on the left, feminists, human rights community, to these horrific occurrences. Some groups initially hesitated, some posted and then retracted or censored the information, citing the need for further evidence in a situation where obtaining such documentation is inherently challenging, if not impossible. This reaction, what struck me about this reaction is how it stood in stark contrast to the global gender-based violence movement's typical emphasis on the importance of listening to and believing survivors' accounts. When other groups have been subjected to gender-based violence, feminist leaders, women's groups, UN bodies, including independent experts, move swiftly, some cases within days, to speak out. Such was the case during the brutal crackdown on Iranian girls and women for taking off their head coverings, the Yazidi women who were subjected to horrific treatment, or Nigerian women at the hands of the Boko Haram, the kidnapping, and some of those women are still in captivity. The feminist groups, the women's groups, the human rights groups did not wait more than 2 months to speak out about it or to demand evidence. We have heard from critics that when the evidence is shown, in fact this happened at one screening, that it's not enough. There was a screening in Los Angeles where of the 46-minute movie showing much of this. There's more evidence that I've seen as well, which is more horrific if that's possible. And the cry in the audience from some people was, show us the rapes. The pictures of the dead women and the mutilated women with their underwear down around their knees, picture was not sufficient. I wondered, did the same person demand to see the rapes of women who came forth as part of the Me Too movement? There the watchword was, believe the women. Too many of those who make their mandate, whose raison d'etre is fighting gender-based violence, remain silent, have remained silent, only reluctantly spoken out. I echo U.S. Ambassador, my colleague U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield's sentiment, who said in the Security Council when this issue came up, where is the universal condemnation? Where is the outrage? My stance is clear. The voices of all women, it doesn't matter who they are, must be heard. Any woman's experience of gender-based violence should not be silenced or discredited. That does not mean at times you will get wrong claims, or claims that are used for other purposes, but when you see it over and over and over again in so many different places during that October 7th, your sense is that you're not seeing gender-based violence as a consequence of war, but gender-based violence as a policy of war, given that it happened in the same way in so many places. It's wrong for anyone to remain silent in the face of such horrific violence, but for those who claim as their mandate human rights and protection of women, it is more than wrong. It is hypocrisy of the first order and calls into question their larger agenda, and it is anti-Semitic. What accounts for this clear reticence to speak out, the only difference when looking at these different cases that I could find with my colleagues at the State Department who looked at it with me, were that these women were perceived to be Jewish. They weren't all Jewish. There were Muslim women, there were Druze women, there were foreigners, visitors, tourists, etc., but the perception was, and the vast majority were Jews. The signs that followed suggested a anti-Semitism that must be acknowledged and addressed. And of course it mimics patterns of Holocaust denial, perpetuating the cycle of anti-Semitism by furthering the stereotype that Jews are untrustworthy and need to be called out. Of course, since October 7th, we've had many people who engage in anti-Semitism then say, oh, but I decry anti-Semitism, I'm not being anti-Semitic, I'm just being critical of Israel. There's a difference. There are those who are critical of Israel, and there certainly is room to be critical of Israel, as many Israelis will tell you. The national sport of Israel is not football, it's criticism of the government, and everyone knows they're right. We've also, there's been much discussion of the difference or the relationship between anti-Semitism and this criticism of Israel, or anti-Zionism in the sense of questioning the right of Israel to exist. And for some degree, and I've often asked that question, in recent days and weeks, I've pointed the people who've asked me that, and I say, to some degree, you're asking the wrong person that question. To some degree, that question has been answered by those who are who present themselves as opponents of Israel, sometimes supporters of Hamas, and supporters of Hamas. When about a few days after the Hamas attacks in front of the Sydney Opera House, people marched, excuse me, I'm quoting, "Fuck the Jews." If you listen to the tape, it certainly sounds also like "Gas the Jews." They claim it's "Where were the Jews? Where are the Jews?" But even if that's there, why were they asking if there were? First of all, nothing. Israel hadn't done anything. It was October 8th and 9th. Where are the Jews? Or when synagogues in Montreal and Philadelphia were torched in supposed support of Palestinians, or when Jews wearing kippot or Jewish stars or speaking Hebrew were harassed, including here in London, or restaurants trashed, or as happened in New York and happened in Toronto, hospitals, access to hospitals were denied, Palestinian people climbed on top and hung Palestinian flags. In both cases, the hospitals were Mount Sinai Hospital. Or even the horrific accusation that the IDF is harvesting organs from Palestinians, which is the revival of the anti-Semitic canard and the blood libel myth. Or even when there are calls for globalize the Intifada. One can debate what the Intifada means, but globalization means go after all globally. It's not, I don't think it means find every Jew who might be backpacking in Nepal or something, but go after Jews. For these protesters, that difference has been erased. I'm not saying there's not room for a vigorous intellectual and academic discussion for the relationship between the two, but at the same time, the reality must be faced. And many of these comments, of course, were made, including here in the UK, as the recent studies have shown, and comments and anti-Semitic actions, attacks on synagogues, harassment of Jews in the days immediately following October 7th, before there had been any military action by Israel. That's why I call it anti-Semitism. In conclusion, really, ultimately, governments and civil societies must understand that anti-Semitism must be openly and vigorously fought. And this is what the U.S. government has done with its landmark whole-of-society government national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, released this past May, which was widely endorsed across the Jewish community and the general American community, and which we believe serves as a model for us to move forward on this issue. Let me close by putting anti-Semitism in a somewhat larger context, and this, of course, could be a lecture in and of itself, but I think it's important that those of you who consider anti-Semitism important enough to come out on a rainy February night to a lecture, is that I think it's also important to start thinking about anti-Semitism in a somewhat different or larger context. By that I mean, of course, I call it the multi-layered approach to anti-Semitism. First layer, of course, is as a threat to Jews and Jewish communities. And that alone would make it a trend worthy of governments fighting, because after all, the job of a government is to act on a national level in loco parentis, to protect its citizens, particularly its vulnerable citizens. That's why there are laws for protection of children, the elderly, ill, protection of water, etc., to make sure that the society is protected. So were anti-Semitism only a threat against Jews, it would be a valid thing for governments to address vigorously. But it happens that it is more than just that. And I would urge you to think of it in this broader context as I make the other add the other two layers to it. It is also a threat to democracy. Anybody who buys into the conspiracy myth, which is at the heart of anti-Semitism, as I said at the outset, has essentially given up on democracy. They believe that the Jews control the media, the banks, the governments, the electoral system, I always wonder if the Jews control the banks, where's my ATM machine? No one is talking. But in all due seriousness, so it's a threat to democracy in that way, but it's a threat to democracy in another way as well, and this leads me to the third layer, as a threat to democracy and national security and stability. Authoritarian governments love anti-Semitism, whether they're from the far left as the USSR and the communist bloc, or the far right as the Nazis. It is something that is an attraction to them. They will use, very often anti-Semitism will be part of their policy planks, but we also see, particularly graphically since October 7th, but before that as well, what we call in the American intelligence community, not intelligent, but intelligence community, malign influencers, or more colloquial put, bad actors, use anti-Semitism, to use a very arcane academic term, as a kochlöffel, a cooking spoon, to stir up the pot. To stir up the pot, particularly in democracies. To make, it's what we call active measures, what students of disinformation call active measures. To use anti-Semitism as one of the tools to make democracy already a very fragile system. I'm reminded of Winston Churchill saying democracy is a terrible form of government except for all the others. And I would say that about its fragility, it is one of the most fragile forms of government because it calls for a compact amongst its citizens. Well, if I can divide amongst those citizens, if I can make anti-Semitism look like a failed system, if I can convince, sometimes when you study, I've done a little bit of study, because I've been interested in the study of active measures, disinformation by these malign influencers. Their attempts to disrupt don't have to succeed as long as they disrupt. The example that I use is in October, Hamas declared a day of rage throughout the world. and many parents of children who went to Jewish schools, despite often the schools urging the parents not to keep their kids home, did keep their kids home. In France, I think it was above 80% of the children stayed home, even though there were gendarmes and all sorts of security around the schools, not being the least bit critical. If it was my child, I can make speeches and strong statements. If it was my child, I don't know that I would use them to make a statement. But in any case, nothing happened. But the day, from the perspective of those who declared for the Day of Rage, was successful, because it disrupted the life of the community, and it made people feel under threat. And this is something that we're seeing. Sometimes we see it coming from countries which are ideologically devoted to, have an ideological devotion to anti-Semitism, in Iran or other countries. And sometimes we see it from countries that may not have that ideological commitment, but it's what I call utilitarian anti-Semitism. They use it. Now, it's not that they're completely neutral on anti-Semitism. They still decide we're going to take this terrible lethal weapon off the shelf and use it. But it's not because of an animus against Jews, but because it's a way of disrupting democratic societies and causing them to look like failed states. And that is one of the steps towards the demise of democracy. So if you if you care about Jews, then of course you're going to care about anti-Semitism. But if you don't particularly care about Jews, if you care about democracy, if you hate autocracy, then you can do no less than fight this lethal hatred with all your soul, your power, and your might. Thank you very much.